On a cold New York evening, a single invitation changed everything. One name was missing, and that omission forced the most powerful woman in American high society to come knocking at her door. That was the night Alva Belmont won. But it was also the beginning of everything she would lose: her marriage, her place, and the illusion of control. Because behind the grandest mansion in New York was a woman preparing to destroy her own empire. At dusk on Fifth Avenue, as winter light faded against cold stone walls, men carried the coffin of Alva Belmont past the very world she had once conquered. The city was quieter than usual, as if even New York itself remembered what she had done and what it had cost. But Alva Belmont was not born into power. She began far from marble mansions and glittering ballrooms in the heavy, humid air of Mobile, Alabama, the kind of heat that clung to your skin, the kind that slowed time. There, beneath magnolia trees and long, shadowed porches, a child named Alva Erskine Smith opened her eyes into a world that seemed calm, but was already beginning to crack. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, was a man who understood risk long before others did. Trained as a lawyer, he abandoned stability for opportunity, tying his future to the cotton trade, the backbone of the Southern economy, and its most dangerous illusion. Cotton made fortunes, but it also destroyed them. Inside the Smith household, life appeared full. There were 6 children, laughter echoing through rooms, and a mother, Phoebe, who tried to soften the sharp edges of a fragile world. But reality never stayed hidden for long. Illness came suddenly, without warning. 3 of the 6 children would not live to adulthood. Grief did not explode in this house. It settled in quietly like dust. A look held too long, a silence that stretched just a little too far, a door closing more gently than before. And in the middle of it all, Alva watched. She was not loud, she was not reckless. She observed, even as a child, there was something unsettling about the way she paid attention, not to what people said, but to what they avoided saying. She noticed tension in her father's posture when letters arrived. She saw the flicker of fear in her mother's eyes when certain names were mentioned behind closed doors. Because outside that quiet Southern home, something far larger was shifting. The country was dividing. Newspapers began arriving with sharper headlines. Conversations between adults grew shorter, heavier. Words like conflict, union, and slavery no longer belonged to distant politics. They were creeping into everyday life. And Murray Smith understood something most men refused to admit. The South was standing on borrowed time. To a child, Mobile still felt endless riverboats drifting at sunset, markets alive with voices, long afternoons that seemed untouched by the world beyond. But for those who knew where to look, the foundation was already breaking. And Alva, quiet, watchful, absorbing everything, was learning her first and most important lesson. The world people trust is often the one about to collapse. The change did not come all at once. It never does. At first, it was just a tone subtle, uneasy threaded through the adults' voices. Conversations that used to drift lazily through the house now ended abruptly when children entered the room. Letters arrived more frequently. Newspapers were folded with tighter hands. And Murray Forbes Smith was watching. He had built his life on cotton, on its promise, its reach, its ability to connect the South to the rest of the world. But unlike many men around him, he did not mistake success for certainty. He understood risk, and now risk was everywhere. The markets were unstable. Political arguments were no longer debates, they were fractures. The question of slavery, once spoken carefully, had hardened into something immovable. States were choosing sides. Alliances were forming. War was no longer a possibility. It was approaching. Inside the Smith home, nothing was announced directly. There were no dramatic speeches, no gathering of the family to explain what was coming. Instead, the shift revealed itself through small, deliberate actions. Drawers emptied, trunks appeared, clothes were folded, not for storage, but for departure. To young Alva, it must have felt like a quiet unraveling of everything familiar. Why leave? Nothing had happened yet. The river still moved. The markets still opened. The air still carried the same thick southern heat. But beneath it all, something invisible had already changed, and her father had seen it. Murray Smith was not waiting for the storm to arrive. He was leaving before it began. In 1859, before the Civil War erupted, he made the decision that would alter the course of his family forever. Alabama would no longer be their home. They were going north. The morning they left was not dramatic. No one cried out. No neighbors gathered to say goodbye. It happened in the soft, muted light of early day, when the air was still cool and the streets not yet alive. Men carried heavy trunks out to waiting wagons. Wood creaked under weight. Footsteps echoed across the ground. Phoebe adjusted her children's clothing with steady hands, smoothing details that no longer mattered. Murray oversaw everything in silence, his focus fixed ahead, not behind, and Alva watched it all. The house she had known, its sounds, its shadows, its quiet griefs and small comforts, was being packed away piece by piece, not destroyed, just left. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from chaos, but from calm decisions made without explanation. A child cannot argue with them, cannot stop them, can only follow. And so she did. As the wagons began to move, Mobile slowly slipped away, its warmth, its rhythm, its certainty dissolving into distance. Ahead of them was something unknown, a city louder, colder, faster, New York. Alva did not yet understand what her father had truly done. He had not just moved his family, he had escaped the collapse of an entire world. And without realizing it, as she sat among trunks filled with the fragments of her childhood, Alva absorbed another lesson, one that would define everything she became. The people who rise are the ones who leave before everyone else is forced to run. A new world that never waits. When the journey finally ended, nothing felt familiar anymore. New York in 1859 did not welcome gently, it overwhelmed. The air was colder, sharper, cutting against the skin in a way the South never had. The streets were louder, filled with the constant clatter of carriage wheels grinding over stone, voices layered over one another, vendors shouting, horses pulling, the entire city moving as if it refused to slow down for anyone. For a child raised in the slow, humid rhythm of Mobile, it must have felt as though the ground itself had changed. The Smith family settled near Madison Square, a place already pulsing with energy. Buildings rose taller than anything Alva had ever seen, their stone faces looming, their windows reflecting a world that seemed too fast to fully understand. Winter came not as a gentle shift, but as a shock. The cold bit into her lungs, her breath visible in pale clouds before her face. Snow fell silently at first, then steadily, covering everything in a white stillness that felt almost unreal. It was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. And yet, even here, the past did not fully release its hold. 2 years after their arrival, the Civil War erupted. The conflict her father had predicted now tore through the nation, dividing it completely. New York itself became a place of tension, where loyalties blurred and uncertainty spread through every conversation. Alva would have seen it in small ways, her parents' expressions tightening as news arrived, neighbors speaking in hushed tones, the growing lists of casualties that turned distant battles into something deeply personal. But inside their home, something unexpected happened. Murray Smith's gamble began to pay off. Having left the cotton fields behind, he turned outward toward international trade, toward connections in Britain, toward opportunities that were untouched by the war consuming the South. Slowly, quietly, the family's fortunes stabilized. Then they grew. What had begun as an escape became an advantage. For Alva, this shift mattered more than she could yet understand. She was no longer just a child displaced, she was a child being reshaped. Summers brought a different kind of life. The family traveled to Rhode Island, where ocean air replaced the dense weight of the city, where waves moved with a steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with New York's urgency. Later, Europe entered her world, its grand architecture, its rigid hierarchies, its sense of history carved into stone. These were not just travels, they were lessons. She saw how power could be displayed, how status could be constructed, how entire societies were built on perception as much as reality. And she remembered. Back in New York, the city continued to grow, louder, richer, more ambitious, and within it, Alva changed. The quiet girl who once watched from the corners of a southern home was no longer just observing survival, she was studying ascent. She began to understand that wealth alone did not command respect. That position could be built, shaped, forced into existence if one understood the rules beneath the surface. By the time her childhood closed, packed away like those old trunks from Alabama, one truth had already settled deep within her. The world did not belong to those who inherited it. It belonged to those who learned how to take it. As the war faded into memory and New York surged forward with relentless ambition, Alva entered adolescence in a city that was no longer simply growing, it was transforming. The streets around Madison Square carried a new kind of energy, driven not by survival, but by opportunity. Wealth was beginning to concentrate in ways America had never seen before. Merchants, financiers, and industrialists were rising quickly, building fortunes that rivaled old European aristocracies. Yet something remained unfinished. Money alone did not grant acceptance. Inside the Smith household, life reflected this delicate balance. There was comfort now, even refinement, shaped by her mother's insistence on grace and her father's disciplined pursuit of success. Conversations at home were no longer shadowed by fear, but they were never careless. Alva listened as adults discussed trade routes, investments, and the expanding influence of American business abroad. She learned early that wealth was not static, it moved, it adapted, it required awareness. But outside their home, another lesson unfolded. New York society was layered, structured by invisible lines that were rarely spoken but always enforced. Old families, those whose names stretched back generations, held a quiet authority that could not be bought. They controlled invitations, reputations, and access. They decided who belonged and who did not. And the Smith family, despite their growing prosperity, stood just outside that inner circle. Alva noticed everything, the way certain names were spoken with effortless respect, while others were acknowledged politely but without warmth. The subtle pauses in conversation when unfamiliar families were mentioned, the careful choreography of social gatherings, where every introduction carried weight, and every gesture signaled position. She attended musicales, small receptions, and carefully arranged dinners where young women were expected to charm without overreaching, to be visible but never dominant. But Alva was not interested in simply fitting in. She was studying the system itself. She realized that society was not governed by fairness, it was governed by perception. Reputation could open doors before a word was spoken, lineage could outweigh intelligence, and acceptance was not granted, it was negotiated, often silently. During this time, her experiences in Europe began to take on new meaning. The grand estates, the structured hierarchies, the deliberate display of wealth she had once observed now became a framework. She understood that power was not just held, it was presented. It was reinforced through architecture, behavior, and controlled visibility. Back in New York, these ideas sharpened within her. She watched how families maintained their status, how they protected their image, how they excluded others not through confrontation, but through absence. And slowly, a realization formed, one that set her apart from nearly everyone around her. If the system could be understood, it could be challenged. If it could be challenged, it could be changed. By the time she moved fully into young womanhood, Alva was no longer simply navigating society. She was preparing to outmaneuver it. As New York continued to expand, so did the complexity of the world Alva moved through, and by the time she stepped fully into society as a young woman, she was no longer learning passively, she was calculating. The gatherings she attended were no longer just occasions for music and polite conversation. They were arenas where status was quietly negotiated, where every glance, every introduction, every absence carried meaning. Rooms filled with candlelight and soft piano melodies masked a sharper reality beneath families, measuring one another, alliances forming and dissolving without a single word spoken aloud. Alva moved through these spaces with a composure that set her apart, not because she was the most beautiful or the most charming, but because she was aware. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was with intention. She noticed how young men positioned themselves, how mothers assessed potential matches, how hosts controlled the flow of interaction to elevate some guests while quietly diminishing others. It was a system built not on openness, but on control. And what fascinated her most was how fragile it all was. A single misstep could shift a reputation. A poorly chosen association could close doors permanently. Yet at the same time, the entire structure depended on belief on the collective agreement that certain families mattered more than others. That belief, she realized, could be influenced. The Smith family's position made this reality unavoidable. They were welcomed but not embraced, included but not central. Their wealth provided access but not authority, and Alva felt that gap with increasing clarity. She stood close enough to power to study it, but not close enough to hold it. Many in her position might have accepted this quietly, adjusting themselves to fit within the limits imposed on them. But Alva did the opposite. She began to think in terms of leverage. If society valued lineage, then something equally powerful would be needed to counterbalance it. If acceptance depended on perception, then perception itself could be shaped. She did not yet know how, but she knew it was possible. Around her, the city reflected the same tension. New money was rising quickly, driven by railroads, shipping, and industry, challenging the quiet dominance of old families who had long controlled social life. There was an invisible conflict unfolding, not one of open confrontation, but of positioning. And in that conflict, opportunity existed. Her travels continued to influence her thinking. Europe had shown her something America had not yet perfected: the deliberate use of grandeur as a statement of legitimacy. Palaces, estates, architecture that commanded respect before a single introduction was made. These were not just homes, they were declarations. Back in New York, she began to see what was missing. American wealth was vast, but it lacked form. It lacked the visual language that translated money into unquestionable status. And in that absence, Alva saw possibility. By the end of this stage of her life, she was no longer just observing the rules of society, she was identifying its weaknesses. She understood that the barrier keeping families like hers on the outside was not impenetrable, it was simply unchallenged. And for the first time, a quiet, dangerous idea took shape in her mind. If the door would not open, she would not wait to be invited, she would force it open herself. By the time Alva reached the threshold of adulthood, New York had become something entirely different from the city she first arrived in as a child. It was no longer just a place of opportunity, it was a battlefield of ambition. Gas lamps lit the streets deep into the night, reflecting off polished storefronts filled with imported goods, while newspapers churned out stories of fortunes rising overnight. The city moved faster now, driven by men who understood that America was entering a new era, one where industry, not lineage, would begin to shape power. But society had not yet caught up. The old families still held their ground, guarding their circles with quiet precision, deciding who would be acknowledged and who would remain on the edges. And it was within this tension that Alva stepped forward, not as a child watching from the sidelines, but as a young woman entering the game. Her presence did not demand attention, but it held it. There was a stillness in the way she carried herself, a control that suggested she understood more than she revealed. At gatherings, she no longer simply observed, she engaged. Conversations with her moved beyond surface politeness, touching on travel, architecture, and the shifting structure of society itself. Men found her intriguing not because she flattered them, but because she challenged them in ways they did not expect. Women, more perceptive, recognized something sharper beneath her composure, a mind that did not accept the world as fixed. Suitors began to appear, as they always did for a woman of her position. They came with family names, with respectable fortunes, with the promise of stability. But Alva was not searching for comfort. She was searching for position. Each interaction, each introduction was measured not by emotion, but by potential. She understood that marriage, in her world, was not merely personal, it was strategic. It could elevate, redefine, or confine, and she had no intention of being confined. Around her, the rise of new wealth became impossible to ignore. The Vanderbilts, in particular, were beginning to dominate conversations. Their fortune, built through railroads and relentless expansion, had reached a scale that even the old families could not dismiss. They had power, real power, but they lacked something crucial: acceptance. To the established elite, the Vanderbilts were outsiders, their money too new, their rise too fast, their name not yet woven into the fabric of tradition. This contradiction fascinated Alva. It was the exact fracture she had been studying: the gap between wealth and legitimacy. And within that gap, she saw opportunity. A family powerful enough to change the rules, yet still excluded by them, represented something rare: leverage. She did not rush toward it. She did not chase it openly, but she watched as their name appeared more frequently, as their presence grew impossible to ignore, as society struggled to decide whether to resist them or absorb them. And in that hesitation, she recognized the moment she had been waiting for. By the end of this chapter of her life, Alva was no longer standing outside the doors of high society, hoping to be allowed in. She was standing at the edge of entry, fully aware that the next move she made would not just determine her future, it would determine how far she could bend the system itself. The moment did not arrive with spectacle, it arrived quietly, almost like everything else that would later define her life. It was during one of those carefully arranged evenings where candlelight softened every edge and conversations moved with polite precision that Alva was introduced to William Kissam Vanderbilt. At first glance, he did not stand out in the way one might expect from a man tied to one of the largest fortunes in America. There was no arrogance in his posture, no need to dominate the room. Instead, there was a quiet assurance, the kind that comes from never having to question one's place in the world. He spoke calmly, thoughtfully, his tone measured, his presence controlled. But beneath that calm was something: unmistakable power, inherited, not earned, but no less real. For William, Alva was different from the women he had known. She did not orbit him. She did not rush to impress. She met him directly, engaging in conversation that moved beyond surface pleasantries, touching on travel, society, and the changing structure of wealth in America. There was an ease between them, but it was not accidental. It was built on something deeper: mutual recognition. He saw in her intelligence and composure. She saw in him access and possibility. Their connection developed quickly, but not recklessly. It unfolded within the strict boundaries of New York society, where every meeting was observed, every interaction noted. Carriage rides through the park, evenings spent in drawing rooms under the watchful eyes of family, conversations that stretched just long enough to suggest something more, without ever breaking decorum. It was a courtship shaped as much by expectation as by choice. For the Smith family, the match was ideal. Their daughter would marry into one of the wealthiest dynasties in the country, securing her future in a way few opportunities could match. For the Vanderbilts, Alva offered something equally valuable: refinement. She carried with her the cultural awareness, the composure, and the social intelligence that their family still lacked in the eyes of the old elite. It was, in every sense, a strategic alignment. When William proposed, it was done formally, respectfully, with the full approval of both families. There was no uncertainty in the decision. Alva accepted, not with hesitation, but with clarity. She understood exactly what this marriage represented. It was not just a union, it was an entry point. The wedding took place at Calvary Church on Park Avenue, a setting chosen not only for its beauty, but for its significance. The day was bright, the city alive with early spring, the church filled with flowers and expectation. Guests gathered, their voices low, their attention fixed on the young couple whose union symbolized more than personal commitment. It marked the merging of ambition and wealth. As Alva walked toward the altar, her steps measured, her expression composed, there was no outward sign of calculation. But beneath the surface, everything was understood. This was the moment she had been preparing for, not consciously at first, but inevitably. When the vows were spoken, they bound her to William Vanderbilt. But they also bound her to something far greater, a family whose fortune could open doors that had always remained closed. And yet, even in that moment of triumph, one truth lingered, quiet but undeniable. Marriage would give her access, but it would not give her acceptance. That she would have to take herself. After the wedding, Alva Vanderbilt stepped into a world that glittered with unimaginable wealth, but beneath its polished surface, something was missing. The Vanderbilt name carried power, real, undeniable power built on railroads, shipping, and relentless expansion. Their fortune stretched across the country, touching industries that shaped the future of America itself. But in New York society, wealth alone did not guarantee belonging. The old families still watched from a distance, their approval withheld behind layers of politeness. Invitations arrived, but not to the right rooms. Smiles were offered, but not trust. The Vanderbilts were seen, but not fully accepted. And Alva felt it immediately. She entered drawing rooms where conversations shifted subtly when she approached, where glances were exchanged too quickly to confront but too obvious to ignore. The rules were never spoken, yet they were absolute. Lineage mattered more than money, history outweighed ambition, and no amount of fortune could instantly rewrite generations of social hierarchy. For many, this would have been enough. The Vanderbilt wealth provided comfort, security, influence in business and politics. It was more than most could ever hope for. But Alva had never been interested in enough. She had not entered this world to stand at its edges. She intended to control it. In the early years of her marriage, she observed carefully, just as she had done in childhood, but now her observations carried purpose. She studied the patterns of exclusion, the mechanisms through which the old elite maintained their position. It was not through open rejection, but through quiet omission. Certain names were simply not invited. Certain families were acknowledged, but never embraced. It was a system built on absence rather than confrontation. And Alva understood something critical: this system could not be negotiated with. It had to be disrupted. At the same time, her life within the Vanderbilt household expanded. She became a mother, giving birth to her daughter Consuelo, followed by her sons William Jr. and Harold. These moments brought structure and responsibility, but they did not distract her from the larger reality she faced. If anything, they sharpened it. She was no longer acting only for herself. She was shaping the future of her children, their place in society, their legacy. Around her, the Vanderbilt family itself began to reflect the same tension. They possessed immense resources, yet they lacked the cultural authority that older families wielded effortlessly. Some members accepted this quietly. Others attempted to force their way in through displays of excess, larger homes, grander parties, louder declarations of wealth. But these efforts often reinforced the very perception they were trying to overcome. They appeared rich, but not refined, powerful, but not legitimate. Alva saw the flaw immediately. It was not about spending more. It was about presenting power in a way that could not be dismissed. She began to think differently, not in terms of participation, but in terms of transformation. If society refused to accept them, then society itself would have to adjust. The idea was bold, almost unthinkable. To challenge the structure of New York's elite required more than money. It required precision, vision, and absolute confidence. And Alva possessed all three. By the end of this phase, she had reached a conclusion that would define everything that followed. She would not ask for a place among them. She would create something so undeniable, so impossible to ignore, that they would have no choice but to accept her. And once they did, the rules would never be the same again. The realization did not frighten her, it sharpened her. By the time Alva fully understood that wealth alone would never secure the Vanderbilt place in New York's highest circles, she had already begun thinking several steps ahead. She had seen how the old families operated, how they protected their status, not through confrontation, but through control of perception. They did not need to reject openly. They simply defined what was acceptable, and anything outside of that definition ceased to matter. If that was the game, then the only way to win was to redefine what could not be ignored. And Alva knew exactly where to begin. Her memories of Europe returned with new clarity. The estates she had visited, the grand entrances, the sweeping staircases, the deliberate symmetry of rooms designed not just for living, but for impression, those places had not asked for recognition. They commanded it. Architecture, she realized, was not decoration. It was power made visible. In America, that language was still unfinished. Wealth was growing faster than culture, and in that gap, something was missing, a symbol strong enough to translate money into unquestionable status. That symbol, she decided, would be a house. Not just any house, but something so precise, so refined, so overwhelming in its presence that it would silence doubt before it could even form. It would not imitate the old elite. It would surpass them. The idea took shape quietly, often in the late hours of evening when the household had settled and the noise of the city softened into distance. Alva would sit alone, considering every detail, not just the structure itself, but what it needed to achieve. This was not about comfort. It was not even about luxury. It was about strategy. The house would become a stage. Every room would serve a purpose. Every space would guide movement, conversation, perception. Guests would not simply visit, they would experience something designed to leave them with only one conclusion. The Vanderbilts belonged at the top, and if they belonged, then the system itself had to expand to include them. Around her, the city was already shifting. Fifth Avenue was beginning to transform into a corridor of ambition, where families with vision sought to leave their mark through architecture. But most were still experimenting, unsure of how far they could push, how bold they could be without risking ridicule. Alva did not share that hesitation. She had never been interested in moving carefully. She was interested in moving decisively. Her confidence was not reckless, it was calculated. She understood that the greatest risk was not failure, but invisibility. To remain in the background, to be quietly tolerated, but never fully accepted, that was the outcome she refused. And so, piece by piece, the plan solidified. She would build something that could not be overlooked. She would create an event that could not be ignored. And she would force the very people who had excluded her to step forward on her terms. By the time the idea was complete, it was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. The door to high society was not going to open on its own. But Alva Vanderbilt had already decided she was not waiting outside any longer. She was about to break it open. Once the decision was made, Alva did not hesitate, she moved. What had begun as an idea, a quiet calculation formed in late-night silence, now demanded execution with precision. Fifth Avenue, still in transition, offered her the perfect stage. It was not yet the unquestioned center of wealth it would become, but it was evolving, shaped by families who understood that the future of status would not be inherited, it would be built. And Alva intended to build something that would redefine that future entirely. To bring her vision to life, she turned to Richard Morris Hunt, the architect whose name was already synonymous with ambition and refinement. He understood Europe. He understood scale. Most importantly, he understood that architecture could communicate authority long before a single word was spoken. Their collaboration was immediate, driven by a shared clarity of purpose. This would not be a house designed for comfort, it would be a declaration. Inspired by the Grand Chateau of France, the design took shape with deliberate intensity. Towers, intricate stonework, sweeping facades, every element chosen not simply for beauty, but for impact. The structure would rise with a presence that could not be dismissed as mere wealth. It would signal culture, discipline, and permanence, the very qualities the old elite believed the Vanderbilts lacked. Construction began, and with it, the city began to watch. Scaffolding climbed upward along Fifth Avenue. Stone arrived in heavy loads, carved with precision. Workers moved constantly, their tools striking rhythm into marble and wood as the structure slowly revealed itself. Passers-by paused. Conversations shifted. The project quickly became impossible to ignore. They called it the Petit Chateau, though there was nothing small about its ambition. It dominated its surroundings, not just in size, but in intention. Some admired it openly, recognizing the boldness of what Alva was attempting. Others reacted with quiet skepticism, questioning whether such a display could truly bridge the divide between new money and old lineage. But Alva was not concerned with their opinions. She was focused on the result. Inside the walls, she controlled everything. Rooms were designed with purpose, not excess. Light was directed, surfaces chosen, proportions measured with a level of care that transformed the house into something more than a residence. It became an experience, one that would guide every guest through a carefully constructed narrative of power. No detail was accidental. Every space spoke. As the structure rose higher, so did anticipation. The house was no longer just a building, it was becoming a statement that the city would soon be forced to respond to. And Alva understood something others did not yet fully grasp. The house alone would not complete the transformation. It needed a moment, a single, undeniable event that would pull the entire system toward her and force it to react. By the time the final stones were set, the plan had already extended beyond architecture. The house would open its doors, but what happened inside would change everything. Because Alva Vanderbilt was not just building a home, she was constructing the stage for the most calculated social victory New York had ever seen. The house was finished, but Alva knew the real battle had not yet begun. A structure, no matter how grand, could be admired and still be dismissed. It could be visited, yet never accepted. The old families had survived for generations because they understood one thing above all: control. They controlled access, they controlled perception, and most importantly, they controlled each other. To break into that system required more than presence. It required leverage, and Alva was about to create it. The plan centered around a single event, a masquerade ball, but this would not be an ordinary gathering. It would be designed with the same precision as the house itself, every detail calculated to produce one outcome: submission. The guest list alone carried enormous weight. Nearly 1,000 names were selected, each chosen not only for status, but for influence. This was not simply a party, it was a gathering large enough to become the focal point of the entire social season. No one important could afford to ignore it. But the true brilliance of the plan lay in one deliberate omission: Caroline Astor. The undisputed gatekeeper of New York society, her approval defined legitimacy, her presence validated status, and her absence could undermine everything. Alva did not send her an invitation. It was a risk so precise it bordered on dangerous. By excluding Mrs. Astor, Alva created a situation that could not be ignored. Because while Caroline Astor could choose to stay away, her daughter Carrie could not afford to miss the most anticipated event of the season, and society had rules, unwritten but absolute. For Carrie to attend, her mother would have to acknowledge Alva formally. She would have to call on her. The days leading up to the ball were filled with tension. Newspapers speculated. Invitations were discussed in drawing rooms across the city. Servants carried whispers from house to house. Would Mrs. Astor respond? Would she ignore the challenge, or would she be forced to act? Alva waited, calm, certain. Because she understood something deeper than etiquette, she understood pressure. And pressure, applied correctly, always produces movement. Then, it happened. Caroline Astor arrived at the Petit Chateau. The visit was formal, controlled, but its meaning was unmistakable. The gatekeeper had stepped forward, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. With that single act, the balance shifted. The Vanderbilts were no longer waiting outside. They had been acknowledged. The door, once closed, had opened, but not by permission, by force. And Alva knew the outcome before the first guest even arrived. The ball itself would be remembered. The spectacle, the costumes, the brilliance of the night, all of it would echo through the city. But the true victory had already been secured in that quiet moment when Caroline Astor crossed her threshold. Because in that moment, the system did not welcome Alva Vanderbilt. It adapted to her. And from that point forward, nothing in New York society would operate quite the same way again. When the night finally arrived, New York did not sleep. Carriages lined Fifth Avenue in an unbroken stream, wheels grinding softly against the pavement as the city's most powerful names stepped out into the glow of hundreds of lights. The Petit Chateau stood illuminated, its stone facade catching every flicker of flame, transforming the building into something almost unreal, less a house, more a spectacle. Inside, the air was alive with anticipation. Servants moved with silent precision, final preparations unfolding in perfect coordination. Music waited just beyond the threshold, ready to fill the rooms the moment the first guests crossed inside. And at the center of it all stood Alva Vanderbilt, calm, composed, already in control. Guests arrived, dressed in elaborate costumes, masks concealing identities that were already well known. Silk, velvet, jewels, catching the light, every detail contributed to the illusion. But beneath it, the reality remained unchanged. These were the same people who had once kept their distance, the same families who had questioned whether the Vanderbilts truly belonged. Now they were here, stepping willingly into a world Alva had created. The doors opened, and the night began. Music rose through the halls, echoing against carved walls and polished floors. Laughter followed, light at first, then building as the rhythm of the evening took hold. Couples moved across the rooms, guided not just by sound, but by design. Every space led naturally into the next, every detail shaping the experience without drawing attention to itself. Guests did not simply attend the ball, they were absorbed by it. They moved through a sequence of impressions, each one reinforcing the same message. This was not imitation, this was authority. Conversations shifted as the night unfolded. Admiration replaced skepticism. Doubt dissolved into acceptance. The house, the event, the precision of it all left no room for dismissal. Even those who had arrived prepared to judge found themselves disarmed, their expectations quietly dismantled. And at some point, no one could say exactly when the shift became complete. The Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders. They were central. As the hours passed, the illusion of separation between old and new wealth began to collapse. Under the glow of chandeliers and the anonymity of masks, the rigid lines of society blurred, then faded. What remained was recognition, not granted, forced. By the time dawn approached, the music softened, conversations slowed, and guests began to leave, carrying with them the memory of something they could not ignore. Outside, the city waited in silence, unaware that within those walls, its social order had been rewritten. Inside, the final moments lingered. Masks were removed, set aside, forgotten on polished floors. The lights dimmed gradually, the echoes of laughter fading into stillness. And in that quiet, the meaning of the night settled into place. Alva had done what no one else had managed to achieve. She had not asked for acceptance. She had engineered it. But as the last guests departed and the house returned to silence, one truth remained: victory, once achieved, does not end the game. It changes it. And for Alva Vanderbilt, this night was not the conclusion of her story. It was the beginning of everything that would follow and everything that would begin to fall apart. After the night that reshaped New York society, nothing looked the same, but everything felt quieter. The doors that had once been closed now opened easily. Invitations arrived without hesitation. Names that once carried distance now carried familiarity. The Vanderbilts were no longer questioned. They were established. And at the center of it all stood Alva, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as a force that had altered the structure itself. The Petit Chateau became more than a residence. It became a stage that never truly dimmed. Even in its calmest moments, the house held a presence, as if it remembered what it had accomplished. Sunlight moved across polished floors, catching the edges of gilded surfaces. Footsteps echoed softly through halls designed for movement, for flow, for attention. Everything functioned exactly as she intended. Alva filled the space with gatherings, each one carefully shaped, though never appearing so. Musicians, artists, travelers from Europe, voices that added depth to conversation, that elevated the atmosphere beyond mere display. Guests left not just impressed, but changed in subtle ways they could not always explain. This was no longer about proving worth. That had already been done. Now it was about maintaining control. She moved through these rooms with precision, her presence steady, her influence unmistakable. She understood people, their habits, their expectations, their weaknesses. She knew when to elevate, when to withhold, when to allow silence to carry more weight than words. In a world built on perception, she had mastered its language completely. Beyond Fifth Avenue, another world unfolded. Idle Hour, the Long Island estate she oversaw with the same intensity, offered contrast, a different kind of power. Where the chateau demanded attention, Idle Hour allowed distance. Wide verandas, open air, the steady rhythm of water nearby, it created the illusion of ease, though nothing in Alva's life was ever without intention. Here, her children moved more freely. Consuelo, still young but already shaped by expectation, grew under careful guidance. William Jr. and Harold followed, their lives structured by both privilege and discipline. Alva was not a distant mother. She was deliberate. Every decision, every lesson, every environment was chosen with the future in mind. She was not raising children. She was shaping legacy. To the outside world, it appeared perfect. Wealth, influence, recognition, everything aligned. The woman who had forced her way into the highest ranks now stood firmly within them, admired even by those who had once resisted her. But beneath that perfection, something subtle began to shift, not visible at first, not spoken, just a change in rhythm. William's presence, once steady, became less consistent, his attention divided. His time, increasingly spent away from the world she controlled so completely. At first, it was easy to ignore. Success often brought distance. Responsibility demanded absence. These were acceptable explanations, reasonable ones, but Alva was not someone who accepted surface answers. She noticed patterns, the late returns, the unexplained absences, the faint trace of something unspoken that lingered just beneath the surface of their marriage. She did not react. Not yet. Instead, she did what she had always done. She observed. Because while the world saw a woman who had reached the top, Alva understood something far more dangerous than failure. Success creates its own kind of vulnerability. And somewhere, quietly, beneath the weight of everything she had built, the first fracture had already begun to form. At first, it was nothing obvious, nothing that could be named or confronted, just a feeling, a slight delay in conversation, a glance that didn't quite land, a presence that felt divided. William had always been measured, never overly expressive, but now there was a difference even in his silence. It no longer felt steady, it felt absent. He began spending more time away from the house, his reasons always reasonable, always delivered with the same calm tone that made questioning them seem unnecessary. Business, meetings, obligations that could not be avoided. And for a time, Alva allowed those explanations to exist without challenge. Not because she believed them completely, but because she was gathering something more valuable than answers' certainty. The world around her continued to move as expected. The petite chateau remained full of life, its rooms echoing with conversation, music, carefully curated gatherings that reinforced everything she had built. Guests came and went, admiration unchanged. Society still revolved, still responded to her presence with the same recognition she had fought to secure. On the surface, nothing had shifted. But Alva knew better than anyone that surface was rarely the truth. She had built her life by understanding what lay beneath it, and now, beneath the perfection she had created, something was weakening. Rumors began the way they always do, not directly, not openly, but through fragments. A name mentioned too casually, a conversation that ended too quickly when she approached, a tone carefully controlled, but carrying something just beneath it. She did not ask questions. She did not confront anyone. She listened, she watched. She allowed the pieces to come together on their own, and slowly they did. William was not simply absent. He was elsewhere, with someone else. The knowledge did not arrive as a shock. It settled in quietly, almost with a sense of inevitability. Alva had spent her life understanding systems, patterns, human behavior. This was no different. The signs had been there. She had simply waited until they formed something undeniable. Still, she said nothing, not because she accepted it, but because she understood the weight of what it meant. In her world, A marriage was not just personal, it was structural. It carried expectations, appearances, consequences that extended far beyond two individuals. Many women endured what she now faced. They maintained composure, preserved the image, allowed the private truth to remain exactly that private. Society did not demand happiness, it demanded stability, but Alva was not built for quiet endurance. The idea of maintaining a facade that concealed something so fundamental did not sit within her easily. She had constructed everything in her life with intention, with clarity. Deception, especially within her own home, was not something she could simply absorb, and yet she did not act. Not immediately. Instead, she turned inward. The house, once a stage for her control, became a place of reflection. Late at night, when the movement had stopped and the rooms fell into silence, she walked through them alone. The same halls that had once carried music now held stillness. The same light that had illuminated celebration now revealed emptiness in ways it never had before. She examined her life the way she had once examined society carefully, without emotion clouding her judgment. What had she built? What had it cost? And most importantly, what was she willing to accept moving forward? Outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything was beginning to shift. And somewhere in that quiet, unspoken space between knowledge and action, a decision was forming slowly, precisely, and with the same inevitability that had defined every turning point in her life. The house remained flawless, the routines unchanged. The world outside still convinced that nothing had shifted, but inside Alva, the silence had taken on a different weight. It was no longer the silence of observation, it was the silence of decision. She no longer questioned what was happening. She understood it fully. William's absences were no longer patterns to analyze, they were facts. His distance was no longer subtle, it was defined. And what once might have been dismissed or endured had now crossed a line she could not ignore. Yet she did not confront him. Not in anger, not in desperation. That was never her way. Instead, she moved with a calm that was almost unsettling. She continued to host, to appear, to maintain the world she had built. But now there was a difference. She was no longer sustaining it for him. She was sustaining it for herself, for her children, for what came next. At idle hour, the contrast became sharper. The estate, with its open air and quiet rhythm, should have offered peace. Instead, it revealed distance more clearly than ever. William's presence there felt temporary, almost disconnected, as though he moved through the space without truly belonging to it. Conversations became shorter, eye contact less frequent. The space between them, once invisible, now existed in every room. At night, a single detail began to repeat itself, a light in a distant wing of the house. Sometimes faint, sometimes steady, but always there. It did not require explanation. Alva never approached it, never questioned it. She did not need to. That light became something else entirely, a symbol, a quiet confirmation of everything she already knew. And each night, as she passed it, she felt the distance between her life as it was and her life as it would have to become. Her thoughts turned increasingly toward independence, not as an emotional reaction, but as a logical conclusion. She had built her life through clarity, through control, through an unwillingness to accept limits imposed by others. Why should this be any different? The expectations of society were clear. Women in her position endured. They preserved the image. They absorbed betrayal in silence to protect status. But Alva had never lived her life according to expectation. She had rewritten rules before. She could do it again. Still, she moved carefully. There was too much at stake to act without precision. Her children, their future, their stability. Every decision now carried weight beyond herself. She began to consider what would be required not just emotionally, but practically. Evidence, position, timing. The same strategic thinking that had once elevated her into society now turned inward, focused on dismantling the very structure she had entered. Late at night, she would sit alone, the house quiet around her, the memory of that distant light still present even when unseen. She did not rush, she did not hesitate, she prepared, because this would not be a reaction. it would be a move. And when Alva Vanderbilt finally acted, it would not be out of anger or heartbreak or impulse. It would be with the same precision that had defined every victory in her life. The world still believed her story had reached its peak. But in truth, everything she had built so far had only led to this moment, the moment where she would decide whether to remain within the structure or break it completely. By the time the decision fully formed, it no longer felt like a risk, it felt like clarity. The uncertainty that once lingered had disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous: certainty without hesitation. Alva had reached the point where continuing, as she was no longer required strength, it required compromise. And compromise, in this case, meant accepting a life built on appearances rather than truth. That she could not allow. The shift was not visible to the outside world. Society continued as it always had: dinners, invitations, carefully structured interactions that reinforced the illusion of stability. Her name still carried weight. Her presence still commanded attention. Nothing had changed, except everything. Behind closed doors, Alva's focus narrowed. She began gathering what she needed, not emotionally, but strategically. She understood that if she moved, she could not fail. A separation of this magnitude, within a family of such prominence, would not be forgiven if it appeared impulsive or unsupported. It had to be precise. Evidence was essential, not rumor, not assumption, proof. She reviewed details quietly, without drawing attention, examining patterns that had long since confirmed themselves. Every late absence, every whispered name, every unexplained movement, she organized them not as grievances, but as facts. The same discipline that had once allowed her to conquer society now guided her through something far more personal. At the same time, she considered the consequences. Divorce in her world was not simply uncommon, it was scandalous. Women did not leave. They endured. They maintained composure, protected the family name, absorbed personal cost for the sake of public stability. To step outside of that expectation was to invite judgment, speculation, and in many cases, isolation. But Alva saw it differently. Remaining in a broken structure was not stability, it was illusion. And she had spent her life dismantling illusions. Her greatest concern was not society, it was her children. Consuelo, growing into a world that would soon begin placing its own expectations upon her. William Jr. and Harold, whose futures would be shaped not just by wealth, but by the decisions made within their home. Alva considered carefully what example she would leave them: silence or strength, endurance or integrity. The answer became clear. She would not teach them to accept what should not be accepted. She would show them that position meant nothing without self-respect. As the months passed, her resolve did not weaken. It sharpened. The life she had built, the houses, the influence, the recognition no longer defined her. They were tools, achievements, but they were not her foundation. She herself was the foundation. And that foundation could not remain within something that no longer aligned with who she was. By the time she reached the final stage of her preparation, there was no hesitation left, no doubt, only action waiting for its moment. Because Alva Vanderbilt was about to do something that even the most powerful women of her time would never dare attempt. She was about to walk away not from failure, but from success. And in doing so, she would challenge not just her marriage, but the very expectations that had defined women in her world for generations. When the decision finally became action, it did not explode, it spread. Quietly at first, carried in whispers that moved through drawing rooms and across polished tables, slipping into conversations that were meant to remain controlled. A Vanderbilt divorce, the words alone were enough to disrupt the balance of New York society. It was not supposed to happen. Women of her position did not initiate separation. They adapted, they endured. They preserved the structure, no matter the cost. But Alva had never been interested in preserving anything that was already broken. In the spring of 1895, she filed for divorce. The act itself was precise, supported, undeniable. There was no room for speculation about motive, only reaction to the fact that it had happened at all. and reaction came quickly. Newspapers moved carefully, aware of the power surrounding the Vanderbilt name, yet unable to ignore the significance of the event. Society responded less publicly, but more intensely. Conversations shifted. Invitations carried a new undercurrent. Every appearance, every absence was now observed with sharper attention. Some expressed shock, others concern. A few, though, never openly felt something closer to admiration, because beneath the scandal there was something else entirely: control. Alva had not been exposed. She had acted. She had not been forced into a position of defense. She had defined the terms herself. The proceedings moved forward with clarity. Evidence of William's infidelity, carefully gathered and presented, removed ambiguity from the case. This was not rumor, it was fact. The court, bound by what could be proven rather than what society preferred to ignore, ruled in her favor. The marriage was dissolved. She was granted custody of her children. A settlement secured her independence not just financially, but structurally. When it was over, there was no dramatic conclusion, no public display, just a quiet finality, marked by signatures on paper and the closing of a chapter that had once defined her place in the world. But what followed was far more significant than the divorce itself. Alva did not retreat. She did not disappear into privacy to allow the noise to settle. Instead, she remained visible, present, composed. She attended gatherings, engaged in conversation, carried herself with the same precision as before, but now there was a difference. She no longer represented a position within a marriage. She represented herself, and that distinction unsettled people more than the scandal ever could. Because it challenged something deeper than gossip, it challenged expectation. If a woman of her standing could walk away, could act with certainty, could rebuild without apology, then the structure itself was no longer as fixed as it had once seemed. For William, the outcome was accepted with a kind of quiet resignation. The evidence had spoken, the decision had been made, the consequences unavoidable. But for Alva, this was not an ending shaped by loss. It was a transition shaped by intention. The world had expected her to endure. Instead, she had chosen to change the terms entirely, and in doing so, she had not just altered her own life, she had sent a signal through the very society she once fought to enter. That power, once understood, does not need permission, and once exercised, it cannot be easily contained again. After the papers were signed and the noise of scandal began to settle into memory, something unexpected happened. Alva did not diminish. If anything, she became more defined. The identity she had once carried as a Vanderbilt wife had dissolved, but in its place stood something far more difficult for society to categorize: a woman who had stepped outside the structure and remained standing. In a world where reputation was often tied to marriage, her independence unsettled people in ways they did not openly admit. She was no longer protected by the role she once held, yet she did not appear vulnerable. She moved through New York with the same composure, the same control, but now there was no illusion attached to it. What she was, she had chosen. Invitations did not disappear. Conversations did not fade. If anything, curiosity drew people closer. Some wanted to understand how she had done it. Others wanted to see whether she would falter. But Alva offered them neither explanation nor weakness. She simply continued. Her focus shifted inward at first, toward stabilizing the world she had preserved for her children. Their routines remained intact, their environment unchanged, their future protected from the turbulence that had briefly surrounded their family name. She was deliberate in this, ensuring that what she had broken apart did not fracture what still mattered. But beyond that immediate responsibility, something else began to take shape, a different kind of life. One not defined by entry into society, nor by control over it, but by direction. For the first time, her position was entirely her own. She did not need to navigate through expectation. She could define it. It was during this period that Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont stepped more clearly into her world. He had always existed at the edges, present, familiar, moving within the same circles, but now, the nature of their connection changed. Their conversations, once casual, deepened. There was no performance between them, no requirement to maintain appearances. He spoke to her as an equal, and more importantly, he listened. For Alva, this was not a small difference. It was fundamental. Oliver understood her in ways that did not require explanation. He recognized her intelligence, her clarity, her refusal to accept limitations, simply because they were expected. And in return, she found something she had not built, not controlled, but simply experienced. Compatibility. Their relationship did not develop with urgency. It did not need to. It unfolded naturally, grounded in mutual respect rather than strategy. And when he proposed, it was not a transaction. It was a choice. Alva accepted, not because she required security, she had already secured that herself, but because she recognized the value of a partnership that aligned with who she had become. Their marriage, in 1896, marked the beginning of something entirely different from what she had known before. With Oliver, she was not a symbol, not a bridge between wealth and society. She was herself. And within that space, new possibilities began to emerge. Conversations in their home shifted away from status and toward ideas, politics, social change, the broader movement of a country that was evolving as rapidly as she once had. The world beyond drawing rooms and grand houses began to come into focus. And as Alva stepped into this new phase of her life, one thing became clear. She had already conquered society. Now, she was about to move beyond it. With Alva Belmont, Alva entered a world that felt unfamiliar not because it was smaller, but because it was deeper. The grand displays of wealth that had once defined her life began to fade into the background, replaced by something quieter but far more significant ideas. Their home no longer revolved around spectacle. It became a place of conversation, where influence was not measured by who attended, but by what was discussed. Oliver, already engaged in political life, brought with him a perspective that extended beyond society's narrow hierarchies. He spoke of policy, of labor, of the growing tensions within a country rapidly transforming under industrial expansion. These were not the topics that had once filled Alva's evenings, yet she listened with the same intensity she had always applied to understanding power. Only now, the scale had changed. For the first time, she began to see influence not as something confined to drawing rooms, but as something that could shape the structure of society itself. The conversations around her shifted accordingly. Politicians, thinkers, reformers, people, driven not by status, but by direction, entered her world. They spoke of inequality, of working conditions, of voices that had long been excluded from decision-making. And among those voices, one stood out with increasing clarity. Women. The idea was not new, but it was gaining momentum. Women organizing, speaking, demanding participation in a system that had historically denied them a place. At first, Alva observed as she always had. She listened to arguments, to debates, to the careful language used to frame something that many still considered radical. But the more she listened, the more she recognized something familiar. The structure being challenged was not unlike the one she had already confronted in New York society, a system built on exclusion, maintained through tradition, resistant to change unless forced. She understood that system intimately. She had broken into it, and now she began to see how it could be broken more broadly. This realization did not arrive as a sudden shift, but as a steady alignment between who she had become and what she was now witnessing. Her life had been defined by a refusal to accept limits placed upon her. Why should that principle stop at the boundaries of social status? With Oliver's support, she began to engage more directly, not cautiously, not from a distance, but with intention. She attended discussions not as an observer, but as a participant. She spoke, not to impress, but to influence. Her voice carried weight not because of her past, but because of her clarity. She understood power, she understood strategy, and she understood how systems resisted change until pressure made resistance impossible. The world she was stepping into was different from anything she had navigated before. It was less controlled, less predictable, driven by forces that could not be shaped as easily as a guest list or a grand event. But that did not deter her. If anything, it sharpened her focus, because this was no longer about securing a place within a system. It was about reshaping the system itself. And as Alva Belmont moved further into this new sphere of influence, it became clear that the woman who had once forced open the doors of high society was now preparing to do something far more consequential. She was no longer interested in being accepted. She was preparing to make acceptance irrelevant. The transition was not announced, yet it became impossible to ignore. Alva Belmont, once known for her dominance within New York society, was no longer defined by ballrooms or grand entrances. She was becoming something far more unsettling to the established order, a woman who understood power and was willing to redirect it. The same precision she had once applied to architecture and social strategy now shifted toward a broader stage. She began aligning herself with the growing movement for women's rights, not as a passive supporter, but as an active force. Meetings replaced parties, discussions replaced performances. The rooms she entered were no longer filled with silk and chandeliers, but with urgency, disagreement, and purpose. Women gathered not to be seen, but to be heard. And Alva listened, then spoke. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic. She brought with her not only wealth, but credibility within a system that had long excluded the very voices she now stood beside. She understood how influence operated at the highest levels, how attention could be captured, how pressure could be applied, and she used that understanding with remarkable clarity. Where others argued, she strategized. Where others hoped, she acted. The cause itself, women's suffrage, was gaining traction, but it remained controversial, resisted by those who believed that power should remain unchanged. Many dismissed it as unrealistic, unnecessary, even dangerous. But Alva recognized the pattern. She had seen this before. Every system that maintained control did so by convincing others that change was impossible, until someone proved otherwise. She began funding initiatives, supporting organizations, opening doors that had previously been closed to activists who lacked access to wealth or influence. Her homes, once centers of social display, became spaces where planning took place, where strategies were formed, where voices that had been ignored began to organize with new strength. And as she stepped further into this role, something became clear. She was not simply adapting to a new world, she was shaping it. Public perception followed, slowly at first, then with increasing attention. The same society that had once watched her with admiration now watched her with uncertainty. This was not the role they had assigned her. She was not supposed to move beyond the boundaries of influence they understood. But Alva had never accepted assigned roles. She had rewritten them. Her speeches carried the same calm authority that had once controlled entire rooms, but now the content had changed. She spoke of equality, of participation, of the necessity for women to claim a place in decisions that shaped their lives, not with emotion alone, but with logic clear, structured, undeniable. She did not ask for permission. She presented inevitability, and that distinction made her difficult to oppose. As her involvement deepened, so did the resistance. Critics questioned her motives, her methods, her right to speak on matters that extended beyond the traditional expectations of her position. But opposition did not slow her. It clarified her direction. Because Alva understood something, fundamental power does not shift because it is requested. It shifts because it is forced to. And she had already proven once before that she knew exactly how to apply that force. The difference now was scale. This was no longer about entering society. This was about changing it. And as Alva Belmont moved forward, fully committed, fully aware, it became evident that the woman who had once conquered the highest ranks of social life was now becoming something far more difficult to contain. Not a participant, not a symbole, but a farce. The deeper Alva moved into the world of reform, the clearer the divide became. There was no longer a comfortable space between positions, no room to exist quietly within both society and change. She had chosen a direction, and that choice carried consequences. The same circles that had once admired her began to shift in tone. Invitations became more selective, conversations more cautious. There was no open rejection, not yet, but there was distance. A subtle, deliberate distancing from a woman who was no longer simply influencing society, but challenging its foundations. Alva noticed it, of course. She noticed everything. The pause before her name was mentioned, the way certain hosts hesitated before extending invitations, the careful language people used when discussing her work, as though acknowledging it too directly might align them with something controversial. But she did not step back. If anything, the resistance confirmed what she already understood. She was no longer operating within the system. She was pressing against it. Her involvement with the suffrage movement intensified. She did not limit herself to funding or quiet support. She became visible, active, present in ways that could not be dismissed. She attended rallies, stood alongside women who had none of her social protection, and spoke with the same clarity she had once used to command elite rooms. Only now, the audience was broader and the stakes were higher. There were no chandeliers here, no carefully controlled environments. There was noise, tension, opposition that did not hide behind politeness, and yet she did not retreat. Because this was not unfamiliar to her. Conflict, pressure, resistance, she had faced all of it before, just in a different form. What changed was the scale. The personal risks became public. Criticism sharpened. Some accused her of abandoning her place, of overstepping, of turning against the very structure that had elevated her. Others questioned her sincerity, suggesting that her involvement was nothing more than another form of influence. But Alva was not interested in defending herself. She was interested in moving forward. Her focus remained fixed on the objective: rights, representation, change that could not be reversed once achieved. The more resistance she encountered, the more defined her position became. Because opposition revealed the boundaries, and boundaries showed exactly where pressure needed to be applied. Even within her own world, the shift was undeniable. Relationships changed, some strengthened, built on shared belief, others faded, unable to reconcile the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. But Alva did not attempt to preserve what no longer aligned. She had learned long ago that holding on to the past could limit what came next. And she had no intention of limiting herself now. Oliver remained a steady presence, not restraining her, not redirecting her, but supporting her movement into this new space. Their partnership, built on mutual respect, allowed her a level of freedom she had never experienced before, and within that freedom, she expanded. By this stage, the transformation was complete. She was no longer the woman who had entered society seeking recognition. She was no longer defined by wealth, by marriage, or by the structures she once navigated. She had stepped beyond them, and in doing so, she had accepted something that few in her position were willing to face. Influence comes with a cost. To change a system, you must be willing to stand outside of it, and Alva Belmont had made that choice completely. Whatever came next, approval, rejection, success, or failure, would not be determined by society's acceptance. It would be determined by how far she was willing to push. And by now, there was very little she was not willing to risk. By the time Alva Belmont fully stepped into the suffrage movement, the resistance was no longer subtle, it was organized. What had once been dismissed as a distant idea had now become a visible force, and with visibility came opposition that was direct, deliberate, and determined to hold its ground. The structure she was challenging was not fragile. It was deeply rooted, supported by tradition, reinforced by law, and protected by those who benefited from its stability. And for the first time in her life, Alva faced a system that could not be reshaped through elegance or strategy alone. It required confrontation. The streets where suffrage demonstrations took place were nothing like the controlled environments she once commanded. There were no carefully curated guest lists, no silent agreements guiding behavior. There was noise, disagreement, anger that did not hide behind politeness. Women marched, spoke, demanded recognition in a society that had long denied them a voice. And among them stood Alva, not above, not separate, but within. Her presence drew attention immediately. To some, she was a symbol of legitimacy, a woman who had moved from the highest ranks of society into a cause that challenged its foundations. To others, she represented contradiction, wealth, privilege, and influence, now aligned with a movement many still viewed as disruptive. But Alva did not attempt to resolve that contradiction. She used it. She understood that attention, whether supportive or critical, could be directed, and she directed it toward the cause. When she spoke, she did not rely on emotion alone. She spoke with structure, with clarity, with the same precision that had once redefined social power. She framed the issue not as a request, but as a necessity. A system that excluded half its population was not stable. It was incomplete. And incomplete systems, she argued, eventually collapse or evolve. The question was not whether change would come. It was how much resistance would delay it. Her words reached beyond the gatherings themselves. Newspapers began to cover her involvement more closely. Public perception shifted, slowly but noticeably. She was no longer simply a figure within society, she had become a voice within a national conversation. And with that, visibility came greater scrutiny. Critics intensified their efforts. Some attacked her position directly, arguing that women's suffrage threatened the social order. Others focused on her personally, questioning her motives, her credibility, her right to speak on behalf of a movement that extended beyond her own experience. But Alva did not engage in defensive arguments. She did not retreat into justification. She continued forward. Because she understood something fundamental, resistance often strengthens in direct proportion to the effectiveness of change. The stronger the pushback, the closer the system was to being forced to respond. And she had no intention of slowing that process. The challenges she faced now were different from anything she had encountered before. This was not a matter of entering a closed circle or redefining perception through design. This was a sustained effort against a structure that did not yield easily, but if anything, that only reinforced her resolve. She had spent her life identifying limits and then exceeding them. And as she stood within a movement that was no longer asking to be heard but demanding it, one truth became clear. This was no longer about influence. This was about impact. And Alva Belmont had no intention of stepping back until that impact could no longer be ignored. As the movement grew, so did its intensity, and Alva did not remain at its edges. She moved further in, deeper into its structure, where strategy replaced symbolism and action carried real consequence. The suffrage movement was no longer a distant cause she supported. It had become a system she actively shaped. Meetings became more focused, less about discussion and more about execution. Plans were formed, refined, adjusted under pressure. And Alva, with her understanding of power, influence, and timing, quickly became more than a participant. She became a strategist. She recognized that visibility alone was not enough. Attention could be gained, but without sustained pressure, it faded. What the movement needed was persistence combined with disruption actions that could not be ignored, moments that forced response rather than passive observation. This approach was not comfortable for many. Even within the movement, there were divisions, those who believed in gradual persuasion, and those who understood that systems rarely change without force applied from multiple directions. Alva aligned herself with the latter. Not recklessly, but deliberately. She supported demonstrations that challenged public space, that brought the issue directly into the awareness of those who preferred to ignore it. She funded efforts that expanded reach, ensuring that the movement was not limited by lack of resources. Her name, once associated with society's highest circles, now appeared in connection with something far more confrontational. And that shift mattered, because it signaled that the boundaries between privilege and protest were no longer fixed. Reactions followed predictably, but with greater intensity than before. Public criticism sharpened. Editorials questioned whether women like Alva truly represented the broader cause, or whether they were reshaping it according to their own perspectives. Opponents framed the movement as disruptive, even dangerous, arguing that it threatened established order. And within elite circles, the distance that had once been subtle now became more pronounced. Some doors closed entirely. Invitations that once arrived without thought simply stopped. Social networks adjusted, quietly removing those who no longer aligned with the expectations they maintained. But Alva did not attempt to regain that space. She had already moved beyond it. What mattered now was not acceptance, it was progress. And progress required friction. She understood that discomfort was not a sign of failure, but a sign that pressure was working. The more the system resisted, the more clearly its weaknesses were exposed. Her role continued to evolve. She was no longer just a voice or a supporter, she was a connector, linking resources to action, influence to momentum. She understood how to move between worlds, how to translate power from one sphere into another, and that ability made her uniquely effective. The cause itself grew stronger, more visible, more difficult to dismiss. Women across different backgrounds began to align, their voices forming something that could no longer be reduced to isolated demands. It became collective, and collective pressure changes outcomes. Through it all, Alva remained consistent, calm, focused, deliberate. She did not react emotionally to criticism. She did not slow in response to resistance. She continued forward with the same clarity that had defined every major decision in her life. Because she understood something that many did not. Change is not granted when it is deserved. It is secured when it becomes unavoidable. And by this stage, the movement she had committed herself to was no longer asking to be acknowledged. It was forcing itself into the center of national attention. And Alva Belmont, once known for mastering the rules of society, was now helping to rewrite them on a far larger scale. By the time the movement reached full momentum, there was no longer any space for hesitation. Lines had been drawn, not formally, not declared, but unmistakable. On one side stood tradition, reinforced by law and expectation. On the other stood change, driven by persistence and the refusal to step back. And Alva Belmont had already chosen her position completely. There was no return to neutrality. Her name was now firmly attached to the cause, not as a distant supporter, but as a visible force within it. Every action she took carried weight. Every appearance reinforced her alignment. The society she had once conquered now watched her differently, not as a figure of admiration, but as someone who had stepped beyond the boundaries they had always understood. Some viewed her with respect, recognizing the consistency of her character. Others saw her as a disruption, a reminder that the structures they relied on were not as stable as they believed. But Alva did not measure her direction by their reactions. She had moved past the need for approval. What mattered now was outcome. The movement itself was changing. It was no longer confined to meetings or speeches. It was visible in the streets, in public spaces where it could not be ignored or contained. Demonstrations grew larger, voices louder, the demand clearer. Women were no longer asking for inclusion, they were insisting on it. And with that insistence came confrontation. Arrests, criticism, resistance from institutions that were not prepared to yield. The cost of participation increased, not just socially, but personally. Reputation, security, comfort, all placed at risk. Alva understood this. She had weighed it long before she stepped fully into the movement. And yet, she did not step back. Because to step back would mean returning to a position she had already outgrown, a life defined by limits she no longer accepted. Her involvement deepened further, not in visibility alone, but in commitment. She supported actions that pushed boundaries, that forced conversations into spaces where they had been deliberately avoided. She aligned herself with individuals who were willing to take risks, recognizing that without those risks, progress would remain theoretical. This was no longer about careful negotiation. It was about pressure sustained over time, and sustained pressure changes systems. The resistance she faced now was not subtle. It was direct, sometimes aggressive, often dismissive. Critics attempted to discredit the movement, to fragment it, to reduce its demands into something manageable. But Alva had seen this pattern before. It was the same mechanism used to preserve every structure that feared change. And she knew how to respond, not by retreating, but by maintaining focus. By this stage, her transformation was complete. She was no longer defined by where she came from or by the structures she had once entered. She was defined by what she chose to challenge, and that choice carried a finality that could not be undone. Because once a person understands that systems are not fixed, that they can be reshaped, redirected, even broken, the idea of returning to passive acceptance becomes impossible. And Alva Belmont had reached that point fully. Whatever came next, success or resistance, recognition or opposition would not alter her direction. She had moved beyond the threshold, and there was no going back. As the years moved forward, the intensity of Alva's public life did not fade, but something else began to emerge alongside it. A quieter reality, one that did not unfold in public speeches or crowded demonstrations, but in the private spaces between action and reflection. Influence, she had learned, was never without cost. The more visible she became, the more defined her role, the less room there was for anything resembling stillness. Every decision carried consequence. Every alignment created distance somewhere else. And over time, that accumulation began to weigh differently. Oliver remained a steady presence, but even stability could not prevent what followed. In 1908, his health began to fail suddenly, without the gradual warnings that allow time for adjustment. Illness moved quickly, cutting through routine, shifting focus from movement to uncertainty. The conversations that had once filled their home debates, ideas, plans gave way to something quieter, more fragile. Time, once expansive, became limited. And for Alva, this shift was not something she could control, shape, or direct. It simply happened. When Oliver died, the loss did not arrive with spectacle. It settled in, much like the earlier losses she had experienced in childhood, quiet, persistent, altering everything without announcing itself. The partnership that had offered her both support and freedom was gone, and for the first time in many years, she stood alone again. But this was not the same kind of solitude she had known before. She was no longer the woman seeking entry, nor the one fighting to redefine her place. She had already done those things. She had built, broken, rebuilt. Now, what remained was something more complex. The question of what comes after influence has already been exercised. Her work did not stop. If anything, it continued with the same consistency, the same commitment to direction. She remained involved in the movement, continued to support, to speak, to contribute to the broader effort that was still unfolding. But the tone shifted. There was less urgency, more focus. Less need to prove, more clarity in purpose. She had already established her position. Now she was sustaining it. The world around her was changing as well. The suffrage movement gained ground, slowly but undeniably. What had once been dismissed was now being debated seriously, considered within structures that had previously ignored it. Progress was not immediate, but it was visible. And Alva recognized something in that progression, a reflection of the same pattern she had seen throughout her life. Change begins as resistance, grows through pressure, and eventually becomes reality. But by the time that reality arrives, the individuals who pushed it forward have often already moved beyond the moment itself. Her children, now older, stepped into their own lives, shaped by the decisions she had made years before. The world she had secured for them existed, but it was no longer something she needed to actively maintain. That chapter, too, had shifted. And so, gradually, without announcement, her life entered a different phase, not defined by ascent or confrontation or even transformation, but by continuation. The kind that comes after everything significant has already been set in motion. And in that space, something subtle became clear. Influence does not end when the work is done. It continues in what remains in the systems that change, in the lives that move forward, in the quiet acknowledgement that something once impossible has become part of reality. And Alva Belmont, having spent her life reshaping the structures around her, now stood within that reality, not as someone striving to reach it, but as someone who had already left her mark on it. Without Oliver, the rhythm of Alva's life shifted again, but this time, it did not collapse. It recalibrated. The urgency that once drove her actions softened, replaced by something more measured, more reflective. She had already moved through the most defining battles of her life, social, personal, political, and now she stood in a position few ever reach. She could watch the consequences unfold. The movement she had invested herself in was no longer fragile. It had grown beyond individuals, beyond single voices. It had become a force that moved on its own momentum, shaped by countless women pushing in the same direction. Laws began to shift. Conversations once dismissed as radical entered formal debate. The idea of women's suffrage, once treated as disruption, began to resemble inevitability. Alva observed this change not from the center of every action, but from a place of understanding. She recognized the pattern clearly. Pressure sustained over time does not disappear, it transforms the structure it presses against. And now, that transformation was visible. There was a quiet satisfaction in this, though she did not express it outwardly. She had never been driven by recognition alone. What mattered was result, and the result was emerging. But with that emergence came a different kind of awareness. The world she had once fought to enter, then to change, was no longer the same world. New figures rose, new voices carried the movement forward. The energy shifted toward those who would continue the work into its next phase. This was not loss, it was progression. Still, it required adjustment. To step back not out of defeat, but because the structure no longer required the same force, was its own kind of transition. She remained present, engaged, but no longer at the front of every advance. Her role evolved into something less visible, but no less important. She supported, advised, sustained. The foundation she had helped build continued to hold. Beyond the movement, society itself had changed in ways that reflected her earlier battles. The rigid lines between old and new wealth had blurred. The structures that once excluded had adapted, expanded, reshaped under pressure from those who refused to remain outside. What she had done within New York society was no longer an anomaly. It had become part of a larger shift in how power was recognized and displayed. She could see it clearly now. The patterns repeated at different scales, the same forces, the same resistance, the same eventual adjustment. It was never immediate, it was never simple, but it was consistent. Her own life, once defined by movement, now carried a different pace. Not slower, but steadier. There were fewer moments of dramatic change, fewer decisions that would alter everything at once. Instead, there was continuity, the result of decisions already made. She spent time in spaces that reflected this shift, homes no longer designed to prove anything, but to exist. Conversations that did not aim to persuade, but to understand. Time that was no longer measured by urgency, but by presence. And in those moments, something became clear in a way it never had before. The need to control, to shape, to force outcomes had diminished, not because she had lost that ability, but because she no longer needed to use it in the same way. The structures she once challenged were already changing. The direction had been set. And so, as the world around her continued to move, new ideas, new voices, new challenges, Alva Belmont stood within it differently. Not at the edge, not at the center, but at a point where perspective replaced pressure. She had spent her life moving forward, breaking through, redefining. Now, she was witnessing what that movement had created, and there was a certain clarity in that position, an understanding that influence does not end with action. It continues in the changes that follow, long after the moment itself has passed. By this stage of her life, the world no longer defined Alva Belmont, she understood it. The urgency that once drove her had settled into something quieter, not weaker, but deeper. She had seen how systems resisted, how they adapted, how they eventually changed under sustained pressure. She had lived inside that process more than once, and now she stood at a distance from it, able to see the full shape of what she had once been inside of. The suffrage movement continued to advance, gaining recognition that would have once seemed impossible. Laws shifted, public opinion evolved. What had once required confrontation now moved steadily toward acceptance. And while Alva was no longer at the center of every action, her influence remained embedded within the structure of that progress. It was no longer necessary for her to push as she once had. Others carried that momentum forward, and that in itself was a form of success. She had not built something that depended on her presence. She had contributed to something that could continue without it. There was a clarity in that realization, a sense that the work, while not finished, had reached a point where its direction was secure. Beyond public life, her personal world had simplified, not in loss, but in focus. The grand strategies, the calculated moves, the battles for position, they no longer defined her daily existence. Instead, There was reflection, time spent considering not what needed to be done, but what had already been set in motion. She moved through spaces that no longer required performance, rooms that did not need to impress, conversations that did not need to persuade. And in that shift, something subtle but significant emerged. Identity separated from achievement. For most of her life, she had been defined by action, by what she built, what she challenged, what she changed. But now, with those actions behind her, the question became quieter, yet more complex. Who remains when the work is done? Alva did not seek to answer it publicly. She had never been driven by the need to explain herself. But in the stillness that followed years of movement, the answer took shape internally. She remained what she had always been: observant, deliberate, unwilling to accept limits that did not make sense. Only now, that nature no longer needed to prove itself. It simply existed. The world around her continued to evolve, shaped by forces larger than any one individual. New challenges emerged, new structures formed, new resistance appeared. Change, she understood, was not an event. It was a constant. And those who shaped it did not control its outcome. They influenced its direction. That understanding brought a kind of peace, though not the kind defined by rest. It was a peace rooted in completion, not of the world, not of the work, but of her role within it. She had done what she set out to do, even if she had not known the full shape of it when she began. And what remained was not emptiness, but continuity. The knowledge that what she had changed would continue to move, to expand, to influence lives she would never see. That was the final form of power, not control, not visibility, but impact that persists beyond presence. And Alva Belmont, having moved through every stage of ambition, conflict, and transformation, now stood within that final stage, quietly, completely, and without the need for anything more. As time moved forward, Alva Belmont no longer needed to chase influence. She had become part of its foundation. The world she once struggled to enter, then reshape, now moved in ways that reflected her presence, even when she was no longer at its center. Her later years were not marked by dramatic shifts, but by a quiet continuation of everything she had set in motion. She remained connected to the causes she believed in, particularly women's rights, offering support, guidance, and resources where they were needed. But her role had changed. She was no longer pushing against closed doors. Those doors had already begun to open. Instead, she ensured they stayed that way. The energy of the movement belonged now to a new generation women who had grown up in a world already altered by the work of those before them. They carried the urgency, the momentum, the willingness to confront what remained unresolved. And Alva watched them with a clear understanding of what they were facing, because she had faced it first. Her presence among them was steady, not dominating, not directing, but reinforcing. She understood that leadership was not always about standing at the front. Sometimes it was about ensuring that what had been built did not collapse under the weight of what came next. Outside of public life, her world had become more contained, but not smaller. It was defined by choice rather than necessity. She moved between spaces that reflected her evolution, from the grand homes that once symbolized her entry into power to environments that no longer required proof of anything. Her surroundings no longer needed to declare her position. It was already established. There was a different kind of awareness in these years, a clarity that comes only after a life of constant movement. She saw connections others might miss, patterns repeating across generations, across systems, across different forms of resistance and change. The details varied, but the structure remained the same. Power resisted, pressure built, change followed. It was no longer something she needed to test. She knew it. Her reflections were not nostalgic. She did not dwell on past victories or losses. Instead, she viewed them as parts of a continuous process, steps that had led to where things now stood. The girl from Mobile, who once observed quietly from the edges, had moved through every layer of society, every structure of power, and had left each one altered in some way. And now, she stood at the far end of that journey, not seeking another stage, not preparing for another shift, but understanding the full scope of what she had already done. Her health, like time itself, moved gradually toward its limit. There was no sudden break, no dramatic decline, just a steady awareness that the movement she had once driven forward would continue without her. And she accepted that with the same composure that had defined her entire life, because Alva Belmont had never believed that power was meant to be held forever. It was meant to be used, then passed forward through the changes it created. And as her final years unfolded, she remained exactly what she had always been, not a figure shaped by circumstance, but one who shaped circumstance itself and then stepped aside once that shaping was complete. When the end approached, it did not arrive with the same intensity that had defined her life. There were no grand confrontations, no final battles to win, no systems left for her to challenge. Instead, there was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a life already lived at full force. By then, Alva Belmont had become something difficult to define, not just a social figure, not just a reformer, but a presence that had moved through multiple worlds and left each one altered. The city around her had changed. Fifth Avenue no longer belonged to the same rigid structure she had once broken into. The suffrage movement, once resisted, had reached a point where its success was no longer a question of possibility, but of time. The world she would leave behind was not the one she had entered. And that was not accidental. In her final years, her movements became fewer, her presence more contained, but her awareness remained sharp. She did not retreat into irrelevance. She simply no longer needed to act. The outcomes she had worked toward were already unfolding. The conversations she had helped bring into existence were continuing without her. The systems she had challenged were still adjusting under the pressure she had once applied, and she could see all of it clearly. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes when a person no longer needs to prove anything. It is not emptiness, it is completion. Alva carried that stillness with her. Those who encountered her in these years did not see decline, they saw clarity. A mind that had already moved through complexity and reached its own understanding of what mattered and what did not. Her past was not something she revisited often, not because it lacked importance, but because it no longer required attention. It had already done its work. The present for her was not about creating something new, but about witnessing what had already been set into motion, and when the time came, it passed without disruption. On a quiet evening, her life came to its natural close. There were no dramatic final words recorded, no singular moment that defined her ending, just the absence that follows presence. Her funeral moved through the same city she had once reshaped. Fifth Avenue, again, but different now. The buildings taller, the crowds more distant, the world continuing forward without pause. Yet within that movement, there remained something that did not disappear: memory. Not in the sense of stories retold, but in the structure of the world itself. Because what Alva Belmont had changed was not temporary, it had been absorbed. The doors she forced open did not close again. The expectations she challenged did not return unchanged. The path she carved did not vanish when she stepped off it. And that is the difference between influence and impact. Influence can fade, impact remains. As the city moved past that final moment, as the noise returned, as life continued as it always does, the shape of what she had done remained embedded within it, quiet, invisible to some, undeniable to others. And in that way, even in absence, Alva Belmont did not fully leave. She remained exactly where she had always been within the structure she had once refused to accept and then reshaped entirely. In the end, Alva Belmont was never just one thing. She was not simply the girl from Mobile, nor the social climber New York once whispered about, nor even the suffragist who stood in defiance of expectation. She was all of them, and something beyond them. A woman who understood, earlier than most, that systems are not fixed, that power is not granted, it is constructed, and that once you understand the structure, you can change it. Her life does not follow a simple line. It moves in phases: observation, entry, control, collapse, reinvention, and finally, impact. Each stage built upon the last, each decision shaped not by impulse, but by clarity. She did not rush into power. She studied it. She did not inherit acceptance. She forced it. She did not remain where she was placed. She moved beyond it. And when the structure she entered no longer aligned with her values, she did something far more difficult than rising. She left. That decision alone separated her from nearly everyone around her. But she did not stop there. Where others might have rebuilt quietly, she expanded. She took the same understanding that allowed her to dominate high society and applied it to something far larger, the structure of society itself. And once again, she followed the same pattern. Observe, understand, apply pressure, change the outcome. What makes her story enduring is not the wealth she accessed or the status she achieved. It is the pattern she revealed. The idea that systems, no matter how established, can be reshaped by those who refuse to accept their limits. That change does not begin with permission. It begins with decision. And that decision, once made, carries forward into everything that follows. By the time her life reached its end, the world she had moved through was no longer the same. Not entirely because of her, but undeniably influenced by her. The boundaries between old and new power had shifted. The expectations placed on women had begun to change. The idea of who could belong, who could lead, who could challenge, had expanded. These changes did not happen in a single moment. They unfolded over time, through pressure applied again and again by many individuals moving in the same direction. But Alva Belmont was one of the ones who pushed first, and pushed hard enough to force the system to respond. And that is where her story settles. Not in the mansion, not in the scandal, not even in the movement, but in the shift itself. The quiet, permanent change that remains after everything else has passed. Because long after the names fade and the details blur, what truly endures is the structure that has been altered. The rules that no longer hold the same power they once did, and the path that now exists for those who follow. Alva Belmont did not just live within her time. She bent it. And once something has been bent, it never returns to exactly what it was before.